So our next keynote speaker is somebody that I think most people in this room will have heard of before, and many of us had the privilege of listening to Simon's workshop yesterday. So coming up next is Simon Katterl. Simon is a mental health and human rights advocate with lived experience of mental health and using public, community and private mental health services. He runs a consultancy advising government, mental health and legal bodies on consumer leadership, human rights and governance. Huge job. Simon's work includes advising the Victorian Minister for Mental Health, various government departments, and by providing consumer perspective to supervision. He also undertakes public advocacy in favour of human rights and has written for academic and news outlets as well. So would you please put your hands together and welcome Simon to the stage, please.
All right. Can people hear me okay there? Yeah, awesome. Brody, one of the speakers from yesterday, gave me their tech deck as a good luck tech deck, so I'm keeping that with me throughout the talk as well. So thank you so much to Kaloon for having me here today and the opportunity to speak, and Amanda and the whole team for organising all of this, and Tamara. I don't know if Tamara's in the room, but Tamara for kindly asking me for my slides about 7 million times without ever getting angry with me about it. But I want to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands that we're here on today, and the lands of the Kabi Kabi people, and pay my respects to elders past and present, and affirm that sovereignty was never ceded, and what that means. That can generate real personal and collective responsibilities to support truth and justice, and I guess here in this state, that's something more important than ever. So there's kind of this story we tell ourselves about human rights and change in the mental health system. Human rights came from moral, legal and ideological kind of progress. And the closure of institutions and the expansion of lived experience in the mental health system came because the system recognised the value of lived experience. There's an issue with this story. It's not right. The truth is that human rights progress isn't automatic, and mental health systems don't simply wake up to the value of lived experience. Nor can they be unilaterally kind of shamed into change. That narrative is just too simplistic. Systems aren't broken, and we're not working in a broken system. If a system is producing coercion, if a system is systematically detaining people, if a system privileges beds and meds, if a system pays a peer worker 5 times less than a consultant psychiatrist, if a system is making people culturally unsafe, if a system does not change, despite hearing this for decades, then it is a system designed not to change. Yeah, please. I'm sure people in this room have been saying this for decades. So the problem is not that our systems are failing to learn. It's that the problem is that it's not in our system's interests to learn. So that system, the one that we're engaging with, it wasn't founded on ideals of human rights and lived experience. A product and producer of colonisation, a beneficiary of misogyny and racism, a breeding ground, perhaps the greatest partnership between biomedical and coercive power. These interests kind of organise the foundations of the mental health system that we unpick today. It's not that we haven't seen change. There was deinstitutionalisation, or at least partially, the introduction of lived experience and rights-based reforms. These were real advances, but there's no denying that we're not where we want to be. And this is because there's a relatively stable and dominant coalition that keeps the system in place. By dominant coalitions, or you could say alliances, I mean coalitions of individuals, groups and institutions backed by public opinion who control power and resources in the mental health system. That can include governments and ministers, industry groups, the community, mental health commissions, mental health tribunals, unions. Now that's a fire, we're all going to have to, the system has been alerted, I just heard a beep. Unions, chief psychiatrists, and various kinds of peak bodies. What we have is a kind of dominant coalition served by the system that we see now. The power of the system, kind of, in my mind, like gravity, pulls on these key dominant coalition partners to reinforce rather than dramatically change the mental health system. And it's done by shaping the incentives of each of those players. So those incentives shape their actions so that it's not in their interest to take dramatic change. It's too much of a risk to push for dramatic change. The system shapes their interests, which functions to reinforce the system. What we'll see soon is that the interests of the dominant coalition are open to change, or that we can reconfigure who makes up that dominant coalition. So first, we need to ask the question, well, how does the system kind of find its equilibrium or keep things exactly the same? So we start with the system being challenged. So perhaps it's through education and new information about opportunities to work from a lived experience perspective. While we might see that as a good thing, it might actually be a challenge to the system because it provides a different way of knowing and being. And that challenges different economic sort of incentives within the system. Or it might be a more direct challenge, in the form of criticism about human rights breaches in the mental health system. So the system, and that first step, is challenged. We start with, the system has, before we do that, it's set up routine mechanisms, forms of bureaucracy to be notified when those issues arise. So internal mechanisms are set up, external mechanisms like complaints bodies, and in some rare circumstances, you've got kind of political mechanisms that can drive change too, or at least in theory. So then the system becomes notified of I guess, the threat. But more often than not, those systems or mechanisms fail or succeed, depending on your vantage point, to drive the change that we want. So they fail to promote change internally, and they do so because it's in the best interest of those internal leaders to make the change maker the problem rather than the necessity for change. I'm sure people in the room have had that experience where you name a problem and you become the problem. Complaints don't amount to change because they're not in the best interests of complaints bodies to upset the health services that they oversee and regulate. Ministers don't intervene because it's riskier for them to upset union or health services, knowing that they'd kind of struggle to justify this to the public. So again, those systems have been set up, but they've been almost set up to fail. And this all functions to kind of evaporate the energy for change. Like a wave losing momentum by the time it reaches shore. So internal mechanisms have managed the problem, made someone the problem. External mechanisms have retained their place in the system, almost because they didn't do anything. And the political leaders have managed the political problem to be able to move on to the next day. It shows why change is so hard. But don't let anyone tell you that change is not possible. Let's try with the hardest example. Now, I butchered a story about like Nikita Khrushchev and the USSR yesterday in my talk. I'm going to try to do a better version about US politics. I've got a background in international relations, and so I often try to bring that in, clumsily or not. So let's try with the most difficult example. So slavery was one of the most morally abominable, but also most entrenched social systems that we've seen. The entire kind of colonial agenda of the West relied upon it. It was central to the economy. It was also the source of the United States Civil War in the 19th century. So despite the advocacy of black and white abolitionists and the overwhelming moral case for change, the southern states in the US relied heavily on slave labour. The US Civil War came where the Confederates, the southern states, wanted to secede from the Union largely over that issue of retaining slavery. Now, if you hear the stories told by the US today, they argue that the war was kind of a moral victory, grounded in justice. But the picture is more complex. Slavery wasn't just a good idea. Slavery abolition wasn't just a good idea. It was in the interests of workers who couldn't compete with zero salary slave workers in the South. Now, can somebody scroll down on my notes, please? All right, well, thank you. And Lincoln, so slavery abolition wasn't just a good idea. It was also a difficult issue for the Europeans. It was a complex issue where the Europeans wanted cotton from the southern states, but they didn't want to purchase that cotton because they had their own complex and recent history of slavery. So there were kind of complex interests that were keeping the status quo in place. They were keeping that social system of injustice in place. Lincoln had long been against slavery, but didn't call for abolition for some time, worried that he'd isolate some of the border states, so some of the states that were in between the North and the South, and defecting to the Confederates. But with an advancing kind of Confederate force, kind of winning elements of that war, he needed to renew the case for a shared union. He made the Emancipation Proclamation that you can see up here on 1 January 1863, unilaterally making all slaves in the North and the South free. It was a turning point, both for the Civil War and for slavery abolition in the country. It precipitated a set of changes that kind of isolated the southern states in a way that enabled the Union to defeat and consolidate slavery abolition. It's not a neat story, but that's kind of the point. The neat story, that the country woke up to slavery and fought good over evil, doesn't tell us how current systems of injustice are held in place. So I think this story tells us three things that we can consider today. So first is that there always needs to be a vision and a core group of supporters for the moral case for change. And you find that there's probably many people in the room here today when we're talking about unjust mental health systems. A dominant coalition, and this is the second point, a dominant coalition can hold systems of injustice in place for a great deal of time, but that dominant coalition's interests are open to being changed, or it's open to changing who that dominant coalition is. And ultimately, the ability to do that is about shifts in power, and meaning building power of the people who have the claim for social justice and the claim for change. So my message, don't worry, the kind of the miserable kind of elements of the talk are behind us now, but my message is really that systems won't wake up to lessons of injustice at the core of them, or they're not going to be unilaterally shamed into changing. Instead, we need to understand and shift power. We need to build coalitions for change, and we need to kind of create and shape the incentives, and then strategically kind of use education, collaboration, and advocacy for change. We all contribute to change, but our work is helped by finding levers for change. So leverage points, as Donella Meadows, who's a kind of systems theorist, reminds us, are places in a system where a small change in that thing can produce a big change in everything. And let's explore what some of those leverage points might be in our system. A clear vision is itself a leverage point. At the heart of so many of the debates that we're having about the mental health system, about human rights breaches, about lived experience approaches to distress, suicidality, non-coercive approaches, at the heart of those are competing visions about what the system is for, what the system is meant to do. Today, most people, community and parts of the system, see a successful mental health system as a system that treats mental illness, to use those terms. That kind of purpose produces a system that looks like a Henry Ford car factory, where we're all treated as broken machines on a conveyor belt, put in one end, taken out the other, either voluntarily or by force. When we a different vision of the system and what it's for is to support someone's good life as defined by them. And if we do that, that kind of purpose creates a different kind of government, a different purpose for government, and a different kind of mental health system, if indeed we call it a mental health system. When we challenge parts of the mental health system under the vision of a mental illness treating system, we challenge the system kind of from a place of weakness, because what we're talking about, whether it's ECPR, whether it's IPS, whether it's the things that we care about, those things don't make sense within the vision of a mental illness treatment system. When we challenge the system within the vision of supporting someone to live a good life as defined by them, what we're saying fits within a story of where we need to be and where we are now. So a vision of what the system is for is crucial and a crucial leverage point. Growing power is key. There are very few, if any, major social change processes in history where the dominant coalition just gave up their power. So I don't think it's necessarily a realistic expectation, and maybe it's not worth asking the system to give up its power. Rather, maybe it's better that we ethically grow our power so that we can support ourselves and be able to drive change. And in fact, asking the system to give up power reinforces the power divide that the system might have as well. Strategic alliances are key. So allies are important, but alliances are also powerful because they're built around shared goals, shared values and shared interests that mean the partnership stays together in good times and in difficult times. And also, those partnerships don't rely upon benevolence, where there's a power divide between different, the different players. Being clear, but that doesn't mean we collaborate with everyone or we ally or create alliances with everyone. Being clear about zones of collaboration, but also zones of competition and zones where you're going to criticise is key. It's what advances the lived experience movement's goals. Utilising institutions. So working through institutions is important. Mental health tribunals, mental health commissions, departments, unions, creating new institutions. These are ways to harness resources and power to drive change and to reorganise a new kind of dominant coalition that's in favour of change. Some of the coalitions will serve, some of the elements of these coalitions will serve their time. So for example, I don't necessarily think a mental health tribunal should have a long-term place in our vision of the mental health system because we shouldn't have compulsory treatment. But they control power and resources now, and so we ought to reckon with that fact and work through those institutions to advance our goals. And finally, I suppose the final piece there is law. So law is another vehicle for social change. Here's a resource, and I'm sure the slides will be made available, but here's a resource for you to access that talks more about Queensland's Human Rights Act. So mental health laws are a source of injustice, and they're the products and they produce mental health stigma and discrimination. Human rights laws are one way to address that. Human rights laws they do so by imposing duties on the dominant coalition figures that we've spoken about and make issues of cultural safety, of choice and control, of inclusive care, of lived experience-led services, not just a good thing, but indicative and enforceable in some cases of legal standards. So finally, I'm a former smoker, so there's only love to any smokers in the room here. You know, I'm not hating the player, I'm hating the game. But I think big tobacco is a story that certainly I've been learning a lot recently in Australia's history. So I finished with that example, and it's an example where people could have been forgiven for thinking change is too much, it's too hard. Throughout the 20th century, big tobacco had enormous control over public life. It controlled the information we read and heard. It defied the law without consequence. It dominated the economy, and it infiltrated research and government. As far as dominant industries go, big tobacco was kind of the apex predator. That didn't stop Australian consumers here taking them on. Millions of people are alive globally today because of the advocacy that Australian consumers undertook to challenge big tobacco, including on, for example, passive smoking. The institutions of the dominant coalition worked together, had failed. So you had examples like the ACCC, or I think it was called the Trade Practices Commission at the time, failing to adequately enforce the law. Consumers realised they could take big tobacco directly to court themselves, and they did. They said they were misleading Australian consumers on passive smoking, and they wanted to confirm that this was a breach of Australian law and kind of laws that existed globally. So that the precedent this set was very important. Despite a kind of series of challenges and appeals by big tobacco, Australians won. If you look at internal documents, big tobacco described this as the worst possible outcome, and they were right, because it set a precedent across the globe that saved millions of lives. It didn't stop there. Australian consumers and consumer groups were at the heart of many of the reforms on smoking in Australia that set the standard across the world. I remind us about this because although we kind of have this voyage for change, and it can look a bit like Everest, and that's a picture of Everest in the background, and also that we may have lost, we've probably lost some fingers and toes ourselves along that voyage, but we've also lost people that we care about. Other people have trekked some of these big challenges and these big social change processes before, and I think there's things that we can learn for ourselves about it too. So, look, the world makes us more distressed than we should be. The system often hurts us when it should help. And human rights are not at the heart of the mental health system. But I hope the lessons from some of these voyages are that if we can articulate a vision, grow power, build alliances and utilise institutions for change, we can make that change. Not by expecting miracles, but by making change seem normal. Thank you.